During his inaugural speech, President Tinubu said subsidy is gone, while the statement immediately sent Nigerians to filling stations and sent the price of PMS at the pump skyrocketing. A future without fuel subsidy is something that Nigeria should have been preparing for. The Buhari administration only made budgetary provision for subsidy up to June 30th. But beyond that, the alarm bells regarding how much the subsidy regime has cost Africa's largest economy and largest crude oil producer have been ringing for years now. Earlier this year, Nigeria's NNPC Limited released data showing it spent 4.39 trillion naira, about $9.7 billion, on petrol subsidy in 2022. Successive governments in the country have tried and failed to remove or cut the subsidy, which is a politically sensitive issue in this country of about 200 million people. The increase in fuel price with the attendant consequences is also expected to have widespread economic consequences in Nigeria, where some 133 million people live in multi-dimensional poverty. There are consequences for the downstream sector as well as financing and market dynamics. Joining me now is Emeka Osuji. He's a partner at Olaniwun Ajayi, and we'll be getting into this issue of subsidy because, of course, oil and gas is his specialty. Emeka, thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone.
So I think we need to start with a bit of clarity because in recent times, there's conversation as to whether the petrol that Nigerians are paying for currently is actually subsidized and if we should be paying the current amounts we're paying. We know that the Buhari administration only made budgetary allocations up to the end of June, but given the fact that the prices have immediately risen after the new president's comments last week, many people are wondering what fuel are we paying for? So let's start with some clarity around that situation, Emeka. Can you give that to us?
All right. Thank you very much. But I think that point is one, even though a few people have tried to argue otherwise, but I think it's rather clear. Of course, the PMS that you enjoy, as well as all the downstream products, to the extent to which they are imported, they are a commodity, and there's a pricing to a commodity. And pretty much in this instance, the pricing to this commodity would be the landing cost of the commodity, as well as any other distribution and logistics costs that are required to get it from point A to point B. And I'll give you an example. Say landing cost to get it to the export terminals is X, and the product's coming. But you then need to lift the product from, say, Apapa to Kaduna or Apapa to Owerri in Imo State. Now, if you're lifting from Apapa to the mainland in Lagos, then the distribution cost to get it there will definitely be cheaper than the cost to take it from Apapa to Uyo for purposes of argument. So those are the two components. And I think these are things that people can even independently check and pretty much verify for themselves. So I dare say the pricing we've enjoyed for a while has really never been a reflection of what the pump price should be. And this doesn't just resonate with it locally. Even for a few of the African countries around us, they have benefited from this because the prices are cheaper there. They will rather find ways to source for the PMS from Nigeria rather than pay the prices that they pay in their country. So, frankly speaking, what we've been paying prior to this time has never been a reflection of what the true cost of the PMS should be at the pumps.
And it's interesting you bring up our neighboring countries because in recent reports, we've seen their prices also apparently go up as well in reflection to Nigerian prices rising. And there's always been the conversation around the fact that neighboring countries with this crude oil theft, or at least refined PMS theft, and the consumption numbers for Nigeria, many people believe those numbers don't add up, and it's because of this illegal smuggling over the border. Now with our price increasing and us also seeing a reflection in that, take us through sort of the dynamics that have been at play when it comes to the PMS that Nigerians are meant to be paying for, what we're supposed to be consuming officially, and then, of course, these dynamics of this inter-border or sort of contraband smuggling that we see happening with our neighbors.
Okay, so pretty much, of course, most people would admit that a bit of, should I say, contention in terms of the numbers that government has provided as to what our consumption volumes are. And a good number of people, or some people, believe it should be less than that, but that's debatable. But what are the facts? The facts remain that the pump price of PMS in Nigeria does not quite reflect what the pricing should be. And this is a point that is understood not just locally, but also a few African countries around us who do not produce PMS themselves and need to rely on imports, in this case from Nigeria, whether sourced legally or illegally. So what are the dynamics? So these products come in, say at price X, then the government subsidizes to a certain extent and then says all the retailers should sell at a particular price at the pumps. Now, but within Nigeria itself and then for the neighboring countries around Nigeria, when they then check the numbers that they could get from importing elsewhere and contrast that with the numbers they could get from importing from Nigeria, they begin to exploit that sort of arbitrage. So a good number of them will rather come and find ways to get the product from here. Even if they get it for a slight markup, it's better for them. And even if the marketers themselves, if they realize I must sell for say 100 in Nigeria, and then somebody in Benin is willing to offer me say 120, he will rather get in those products, enjoy the subsidy for getting in the products, and then divert those products to Benin. So that's sort of been the interplay and the sort of that entire matrix of relationships has sort of muddied up the waters, such that ultimately, even though the Nigerian masses would rather not have the prices go up, but you then begin to see that a lot of people may be benefiting from this system. And I think that may have been one of the factors that drove the government to try to see how to sort of bring a bit of order to the system.
All right, so let's talk about our refineries now, because many people seem to think that working refineries are a magic bullet in this situation. We've continuously heard about how the failure of the refineries to be turned around has been one of the issues and one of the justifications for the continuation of the subsidy. But in the long run, when we look at it, do you really believe that simply getting our refineries working is enough to have ended the subsidy beyond the pronouncement of governments and beyond government saying we simply don't have any more money to put into this regime? Is getting the refineries working what solves this issue?
I think they are interrelated, not necessarily interdependent factors. And I'll sort of quickly paint the scenario here. So let's look at those in the midstream sector, and I mean the refineries, and also associated guys who do transportation, etc., for the refined products, right? So, of course, they then need to purchase this crude from somewhere and at a price that is internationally determined. So, if the crude prices are going north and they're going above the 100, then of course, the cost of accessing the crude for these guys increases. Then they refine the crude, there's a cost to refining the crude, and then they will store and distribute, and there are costs to that. So, ultimately, the person who is selling the refined product, who has refined it himself, has to take into consideration the cost of getting the feedstock, the value add in terms of the refining itself, and then the transportation elements and all of the components. And then he then has a price to sell. But then there's the scenario where the government says you must sell at a specific price. That means the price at which he's likely to sell is not the price that if you had left it to the market forces, he would sell. And that has been one of the factors that has de-incentivized people from coming into the midstream sector, because that concern that the projects then do not get in enough revenue, that pricing concern, and for those who have a bit of familiarity with the gas space, that has also been one of the concerns. And people have then said that the best thing to do is to sort of decentralize, to deregulate pricing in the midstream so that people can then comfortably come in and then get in as market players, get in their products, refine, and then sell. And then the markets will then determine the forces of demand and supply. So how do the refineries affect this entire point about subsidy? On one side, yes, the argument does resonate. If the refineries had been ready, then that would mean that at least you have a huge portion of the refined products coming from the refineries. So all this entire discussion around imports won't factor in. Then government will then work with a few independent marketers to focus on the additional elements they need to get us to where we need to get to. So yes, if the refineries had been in place, it would have reduced the numbers and made it easier to manage whatever the subsidy numbers would be or the wage bill would be. So yes, it would have helped. But to the extent to which they are not in place, then that gap then needs to fill. So that's why I said they are interrelated, but not independent. So the refineries will not absorb subsidies. So for example, the refineries, except we do not want them to operate commercially, the refinery dynamics will still play. They will need to assess crude at a cost, and that cost is a floating cost. Because as the international prices of crude oil continues to fluctuate, that will affect the cost. Of course, you have hedging mechanisms and other sort of financial instruments you can use to manage the exposure, but ultimately, the cost will reflect the dynamics in the market. Then they put the value add, as I mentioned earlier, and they will have to sell at price. But what would have happened is if you had more market entrants, for example, the modular refineries, and thankfully we have a few that they play at the moment. If you have more of these market entrants, the market becomes, it actually develops into a proper hub. And with that, hopefully with time, the prices will begin to come down. People will have confidence in investing in the sector. People will have confidence and desire to invest in technologically efficient ways of continuing to produce. And then gradually, hopefully, the prices might come down. But I dare say it's difficult for it to come down to the less than 160 levels or 189 levels we used to have a few weeks ago.
And that's really interesting because you talk about market forces, market dynamics, but I know you're very conversant with this saying we have in Nigeria that what goes up very rarely does come down. And the idea that market forces and the international price of crude oil as it fluctuates should be reflective at the pump is one that many Nigerians typically would struggle to agree to or even understand, because we've seen the situations where at any opportunity to take advantage of a situation, people in certain positions take advantage. So is it really a guaranteed sort of equation that if we see that fluctuation, if we see the price of crude drop, we should see the attendant drop when it comes to the pump price of PMS here in Nigeria? Will we be able to really see market forces come into play?
Well, in business and in commerce, nothing is really certain. And of course, you understand, because particularly for the petroleum sector, a lot of global events have both direct and indirect implications of what's going on. Other macroeconomic factors, inflation, accessibility to dollars, how robust the economy is doing, all these come to play in terms of determining what the fiscal environment and operating environment is likely to be on the short, in the medium, and the long term. But the point you raised about prices never coming down, I don't know if those who remember, about 20, 30 years ago, those that had telephones in their homes, how many people had access to telephones first? For those who had access to those telephones, how many people could afford telephone bills, and how expensive were they? Even the cost of getting a SIM card, just a SIM card, those who remember 30, 20, 15 years ago. But everybody has access to a phone now. I'm not saying that the petroleum sector is like the telecom sector. Of course, the dynamics are entirely different. But something must be said for the fact that when there are more market entrants in the sector, when the sector becomes more viable, it's not just about the competition that occurs within the sector. Even in terms of improving the technologies to reduce the cost also comes to play. So invariably, some of us believe that it might have an impact on prices, but not that the prices will drop. No. To the extent to which, again, I mentioned the prices of the refined products is a reflection of various other prices. And in addition to those things, there's the interplay between what happens in the global market and what happens in the local market. Those things will come to play. And if you check what's happening across the world, check Iran, check Algeria, check Egypt, even India, a few countries, a good number of countries between 2000 and now have all removed petroleum subsidies. And for each of those countries, the prices went up. And it's not in all instances that the prices did come down. So that's correct. In a couple of the countries, the prices didn't come down. But what happened was, government was able to demonstrate in a few instances that it was then channeling the extra revenue savings to other sectors. Of course, there was a bit of trying to realign the fiscals in terms of the market, and then that discipline for a few of the economies who managed it properly. Government was able to do a few other things, savings from it. But to be honest, frankly speaking, I do not think that we can continue to enjoy the prices of PMS that we used to enjoy. The question then, what should then be the new number? Should it be between 490 and 490 something and 5 something that we currently have at the moment? Or should we look at the numbers just slightly north of 300? That really is where the debate is. But going back to the regional numbers might be, let me put it, slightly unrealistic at the moment.
Okay. So you've, of course, mentioned the issues around how the fuel subsidy has been affecting the petroleum industry. And I want us to go there now, because it's been argued that removing the subsidy is an essential part of the Petroleum Industry Act and would also boost the downstream sector of the economy as well. But we've also seen recent divestments in Nigeria's oil and gas sector from international oil companies. And in terms of implications for the downstream sector, Emeka, take us through, what are we really looking at here?
Oh, well, the IOC divestments in the upstream, driven by various factors. Of course, the global debate now around energy transition is one key debate that's coming. So you see a lot of formerly oil companies who have sort of remodeled themselves to energy companies. And they've now, in addition to doing that, sort of diversified their portfolios. What have they done? Reduced investments specifically for new oil exploration projects in favor of renewables and greener solutions in the market. So we've seen that happen. So some of these IOCs have diversified their portfolio and they're trying to pay more attention to things. And thankfully so. In addition to that, has been issues of insecurity in the Niger Delta, and a few of the IOCs thought it preferable to sort of pay more attention to the deep offshore assets, which are harder to assess rather than the onshore assets that are susceptible to vandalization, breaches, etc., etc. So that's happening. So for some people, it's a threat because in the short term, it might lead to a reduction in the volumes in the upstream. But at the same time, what it then does is that it provides these massive opportunities for indigenous companies to come in and play. We do realize that even if the indigenous companies come in, they might not be able to play exactly at the same level of some of the IOCs. That's understandably so. But with time, with that opportunity, we'll then be able to exploit some of those assets. What that does is that we will begin to see in the next 10, 15 to 20 years, massive indigenous Nigerian oil companies. And if they continue to play, and then when you then see how does that tie into the midstream, the refinery sector? So I, for example, God willing, I come by some good money and I get some upstream assets. It then doesn't make sense for me to just focus on exports or just selling crude. I could also collaborate with somebody else who is ready to set up a refinery very proximate to my upstream assets. So when I produce crude, I can channel a couple to the export market, and then I can channel a couple to the refinery. And then if there are issues with exporting the crude that I have, and for example, the pipelines to the export terminals are breached and I can't use it, that midstream opportunity provided by the refinery then provides me an easy route for me to continue to sell and to optimize my production while creating value in the midstream. Mm-hmm. So what's likely to happen is that despite the divestments, to the extent to which indigenous companies, and we've seen a good number of them that are stepping into that gap, begin to then invest in the upstream, and also begin to consider integrated midstream projects that will piggyback off the upstream projects, then you begin to see that value flow down all the way from the upstream down to the midstream and then to the downstream. So that's pretty much what can happen at this. Massive opportunities in that sector. And we're hoping that people will begin to talk more about these things and focus more on the opportunities presented by the recent developments, rather than just to speak about the hard knocks. Yes, we know that it's going to be difficult, at least for the short to medium term, but the opportunities.
Okay, so with the announcement from President Tinubu, the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited also said it is now winding down its crude oil swap contracts and will pay cash for fuel imports, adding that private companies could also begin importing petrol as soon as this month. So I want to take this on because as simple as the statement is, it also makes it seem like, oh, within 2-3 days, we're going to have this done and everything. But we know a situation where the government has not been able to pay marketers or importers in terms of the fuel that has been brought in. So Emeka, taking a look at this statement and what it really means to have the NNPC Limited now say that companies are going to be able to bring in petrol themselves and that it's now going to be paying cash for fuel imports. What does that really mean for Nigerians? Let's really break it down.
Oh, okay. In terms of the dynamics, the NNPC has said, and thankfully, we do have to recognize that one of the critical benefits of the PIA is what is done to the NNPC. You will begin to see a national oil corporation that, unlike before, will then be interested in being commercially viable. What does that mean for the market? It means that it will subject itself to the discipline of the market. The market has a discipline, which is you need to do certain things in a particular way and consequences will follow. So we will begin to see not just a rebranded NNPC, even in terms of its operating model. Some of these are then beginning to signal that the way NNPC is doing things has changed and will continue to change. It will then now begin to operate like other oil companies. So the state is going to drop this crude swap regime, and to what extent? So they will drop it and then they will simply import what they need to import. But you must remember that the NNPC and everyone is aware that the Dangote refinery will come on stream sooner rather than later, whether this year or next year or in the coming years. NNPC is also working on some of its refineries to get them back to, even if it's up to 50, 60, or even 70% capacity. So what that means strategically they realized that there will be access to domestic crude domestic refined products coming in either from the Dangote end or from the NNPC refinery ends themselves. So that means in terms of volumes, it's only the difference between what they are getting locally and what they then need to source that they're looking at. So that means the former operating model and the commercial dynamics has changed for them. And I think that's what they've simply done. Rather than to continue to swap the crude and get them refined products, let us then begin to pay attention to source some crude locally, some refined products locally. For example, from Dangote, when it does come on stream, and then the Port Harcourt refinery, when the rehabilitation is concluded, we source from refined products from those places. Then the difference we will then source from the market. They are also then encouraging private players to also get into the game. So what will happen is that if the market, the pricing is deregulated, and the other private players will come in, they will check their numbers. Does it make sense to import knowing that government will not give us a subsidy? So they will check their numbers and then they'll run it. People have raised concerns and granted, and rightly so, around things around pollution, anti-competitive practices, etc., the related the market, etc. But thankfully, we now know that we have the FCCP now. So we have a regulator that is competition specific and focused. So what we're hoping is that synergy between government regulation driven by the NUPRC and the NMDPRA, the competition agency, and other government instrumentalities need to come back and then begin to now, the way we are doing things is just changing. It's something we must recognize. Yes, to begin to look at those dynamics and then to begin to infuse the discipline into the market.
And I like the fact that we were able to end this conversation about the opportunities that are coming about because of the removal of subsidy. I know throughout the years we've heard about why it needs to go, and apparently now under the Tinubu administration it is gone, but we need to now be more forward-thinking as to what happens next. Emeka Osoji, thank you so much for joining me. Partner at Olaniwu Ajayi. I know this is just going to be the beginning of our conversations with you as we see the developments in the petroleum industry and, of course, the wider and further implications of the fuel subsidy removal. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
All right.